Well, I'm Paul Haroutunian, and this is a story that actually has a non-linear timeline. I'm actually going to start in 1983, a good 12 years after I first heard Mayor Baba's name. I happened to be in India at Mayor Baba's Mandalay Hall, and it was my first visit there, and a lot had built up to this first visit. I've been preparing to go for over 10 years. And I didn't know the protocol that Erich was going to ask the newcomers to tell their Baba story. I heard that Baba had a way of working through the Mandalay that just be prepared if Erich or Mani should ask you to say something. Little did I realize that all the Mandalay that was still alive were there, and the hall was packed. It was a beautiful October day, 1983. And Erich zoomed right in on me after the, initial Jai Babas, and I thought the coast was clear after a few questions, until I realized what was going on over time, which seemed like hours. It was probably about 30 minutes, maybe an hour actually. But Erich slowly started to extract the story from me with a lot of details. And the more I shared, the more I realized, even up to that point, as a 20-something-year-old, how very rich my life with Baba was, which brought me to that point. And I was a little nervous, but I ended up having an absolutely wonderful time telling the story. After I got the hang of it, Erich still continued to ask a little bit more, to bring out a little bit more of the story. And it was all said and done, and a friend I came, he got to talk about Baba a little bit, and a few other people did. And I didn't think much of it until about a month later, when I was back in my home, and had been living in Maine at the time. And I got a letter from Bal Natu. And it was the most exquisite letter that thoroughly surprised me. And I sat with that letter for many years. I never actually did anything with it. And I think one of the reasons why I decided to take Robin up on her offer to do a videotape was in honor of Bal. Bal wrote to me and said, I'm writing a second edition of my book of Baba stories, and I would really like if you would tell your story in written form. And he was very detailed about his request, and he gave me a very detailed outline of what would be in it. And he asked me to not be at all self-conscious about my writing skills or anything to that nature, and that he would be very happy to do most of the editing if I would just tell the story with these key points. He even named the story. He called it, I Am There Also. Because he had very carefully, I noticed when I was in India at Mandalay Hall that day, he was listening very attentively, and he actually took a few notes, which I understood he was in the habit of doing. I was so moved and honored that he asked such a thing of me. At the same time, I felt very inadequate as a writer. I come from an Armenian background and a big storytelling tradition, so I'm a little more comfortable telling stories. Perhaps I'll write the story someday in honor of Bal. As a matter of fact, just when I was discussing the possibility of telling my story for these archives, I was at the Southeast Gathering recently, and I met a woman who's putting a similar book together, and there were 3 spaces left, so I signed up. So perhaps this will be an inspiration for me to tell my story. So the reason why that title is so significant to me is because, well, for one, the Buddhists have a saying, "Ta Twam Asi," which means "I am there too." And it's a saying about the omnipresence of God, or the Creator. And Bal Natu seemed to weave this title from the different storylines of my journey. So now I'll go back to 1972. I was a senior in high school, and I had a favorite cousin who was in medical school. I had just gotten my license. I used to drive all the way from Boston to his house in Albany to go skiing, and we'd have a wonderful time. We grew up together in the same house. His mother was a second mother to me. Our fathers ran a business together. And I was the fourth son. They had a Tom, Dick, and Harry. He was my older brother, more so than a cousin. But on this one particular occasion, I showed up after school, drove the 3 hours, got to Albany. They're very eager to greet me, my cousins, him and his wife. He was in medical school in Albany Med at the time. And he had a big smile on his face, and I had a feeling there was something going on from the minute I got there. And the living room where I stayed had a futon, and it was all set up. It was late. We were planning a ski trip early the next morning, so we were going to say our clothes, have a few minutes together, and go to sleep. Wouldn't you know, in the soft lighting of his downstairs apartment, I noticed something very different than I didn't notice about a month before when I just recently had come. There were pictures all over the walls of this very unusual looking man. Harry and his wife said nothing, and several minutes gone by of chit-chat, and then all of a sudden I looked and I go, "Harry, who's this?" And I believe his wife answered. She said, "That's Maya Baba." I said, "Who's Maya Baba?" She said, "He's the avatar." I said, "What's an avatar?" Now I'm a little mesmerized because there's a glow in the apartment. Not only the lighting, but the pictures themselves seem to have a glow. She said, "The avatar is God in human form. Come down." She had a very short and concise little definition. God in human form, come down every so often, and he's been here before, and this time it's Maya Baba. And the words were intriguing to me, but at the same time, I had my own ideas and beliefs and practice of study. I was 17. I said, well, I'm studying Carlos Castaneda, Don Juan, the teachings of Don Juan. And Don Juan can be in two places at the same time. And Kirsten looked at me and smiled, and she says, well, Maya Baba is all places at all times. That's all she said. She said it so distinctly and with such nonchalant even conviction, it got my attention. The haughty 17-year-old who is very proud of his ability to understand these concepts like Zen Buddhism and the sorcery of Mexico and these journeys of the famous writer Carlos Castaneda. So over the course of the weekend, she handed me discourses. And she said, take it home. I tell you, I never forgot those photos. As a matter of fact, this is the first photo of Baba I ever saw, was Baba holding the lamb. And it's always been incredibly dear to me. And then I also saw this one, which I couldn't believe was the same person. Many of us saw this photo of Baba back in the 60s or 70s. And to me, I thought he was an Italian delicatessen owner from Brooklyn or something. And I was so thrilled with the knowledge of Maya Baba from that weekend that, of course, I wanted to share it. But I was an avid reader, so I read discourses Volume 3 from cover to cover over the course of the next few months, and then I went back and read different parts of it. Now, my first impression of discourses was, why didn't I get this in catechism school? Or why didn't I get taught this when I was younger? But over the course of the next few months, I began to have some inner experiences where I started to remember things. And when I studied Baba's life, I came across a few other books, biographical. And I came to realize, oh, Maya Baba was here in America. All those feelings I had when I was going to church when I was 4 and 5, and the priest would say that Jesus was going to come again. I remember my first thoughts at age 4 and 5 was, he's already here. I had that feeling. When I look back on that, it was around my 4th birthday. Maya Baba was in Myrtle Beach then for his last trip to the West. Are these coincidences? I don't think so. I think Baba has a way of tapping all of us that end up following him in some way, and he paved the way. Now my journey took me to India shortly after. This is an interesting part of the journey, and it's most of my story involves what transpired. I never went to college. I was voted the most likely to succeed in my high school. I had the highest, not highest IQ, but grade average, and I was considered very smart on my way to Harvard and so forth. But those years were filled with a lot of social and political unrest and a lot of experiment with alternative substances, which took place rampantly through my high school years. And through that experience, I had a strong sense that I would be following a different path in life. I worked hard, I worked for my father, I saved money, I bought a van, I drove to California. I wanted to go and find out what this Sufism reoriented was. All I had of Baba was an address in a book, pretty much. And I knew there were a lot of Baba followers in California. That's all I knew, basically. And when I got to California, I wanted to be involved or study, to have a practice. And when I found out from the Sufis that I should cut my hair and start eating meat and get a job in a bank, literally that's what they told me, I decided that wasn't quite for me. And Lord Dimple, I think it was, gave me the interview, he suggested, I said, I think you should go to Berkeley. You'd be more suited there. And I spent about 30 days in a Baba honeymoon of sorts. I realized after the fact that that's what they call it. Wouldn't you know, in 1974 in Berkeley, around Baba's birthday, there was an event every single day or night of the week. And I went from one Baba activity to another, to another, to another. I read God Speaks from cover to cover. I hardly slept. I was so on fire with Baba. Now prior to that, I had 2 experiences that are very, very significant. And one is that I had been reading Be Here Now for quite a while, and I had met Ram Dass. And I was very happy to see Baba's picture in that book and references to Maya Baba. And I had met Ram Dass at a talk, and I mentioned to him that I was following Maya Baba, and he smiled. And all the years after that I ever saw Ram Dass at events, he always had a picture of Baba on his altar or mentioned Baba in his talk. And if he saw me, he smiled and he'd go, ah, Maya Baba. So I made it to a place called the Lama Foundation. And it was a Sunday in the snow, and I heard that they had open house on Sunday. And I parked my van, and I walked over 2 hours in the snow to find this little ashram. And I walked in on a cold Sunday, and the first thing I saw was a picture of Maya Baba on the wall overlooking the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And I had a wonderful time meeting the people there, and I remember sitting most of the day at the library and picking out different books. I was very, Baba's here too. about a week later, I found myself in Zion National Park in Utah. And I was very strong and athletic. And I parked my vehicle. I put a backpack together with some water, some oranges, and that discourse book. And I walked to the top, hiked to the top of Mount Zion. And I just took the book out. And I began reading. And the next thing I knew, it was that I was conscious of, it was getting dark and cool, and I realized I better start heading down. For a period of the entire cover-to-cover book, I was in, you might say, another world. And in retrospect, Baba read the entire discourses to me. I wasn't reading. It was being, in a sense, read to me directly from Baba with the word of conviction of his divine authority. And it was in that moment, in that experience, that I began to get a glimpse that Baba is who he says he is. And I remember that one of the passages said that all man is, a partial manifestation of God, conditioned only by his lack of knowledge of his own true nature. And wow. The journey led me to a meditation with the Sufis. I had met Pir Vilayat. I was very interested in other teachers, but I somehow instinctively knew that they were guideposts to help me. They weren't someone to follow in themselves, even though some of them were quite saintly and extremely aware or had a very high vibration. One of the teachers that I met along the way was Pir Vilayat, and I was particularly interested in him because I liked the Sufi path and I read his father's books. And when I met him and was actually initiated into the order as a Baba lover, I told him right away that I followed Meher Baba. He gave me a big smile, and I said that Meher Baba had spoken about his father and said that his father had laid the cable for his own work in the West as a Sufi, coming here around the turn of the century. And Pir was very moved by this, and he told me in so many words that you don't need this in the sense that if you have Meher Baba. And I got that same message from almost every teacher I ever went with. Yogi Bhajan, I had interviewed with him, Swami Satchidananda, Ram Das over the years, Pir Vilayat. There were many, many teachers that I got to sit with, and I'd always mention about Baba. Every one of them showed an amazing amount of respect and gratitude for Meher Baba in just their face, their voice. Anyway, Pir invited me to go to India on this pilgrimage called Kumbh Mela. Now, I was still fairly naive, and I didn't understand that Baba, although he meant in the discourses, I believe, that the truth of how important it is to find a perfect master, and that you can't come through the planes of consciousness without the direct relationship to a master, I didn't quite understand about how the effect of the avataric advent was for all, and that we did not need to seek out such beings. I was very enthralled with the idea that I would go to this Kumbh Mela in India and meet such masters. I needed to find that experience out for myself. So quite an amazing experience it was to go with Pir Vilayat and the Sufis, and to be at an event which I was told had been happening since pre-recorded history. And I was fortunate to meet a Hindu scholar who spoke excellent English, who explained everything to me. And it was truly one of the most memorable experiences of my life, for many reasons. I actually felt the effects of swimming in the Ganges and the effects of what the Hindus describe as washing your soul clean of karma. At first, my Western mind didn't want to get in the dirty Ganges River. And then I got over it, and when I did, I had a kind of a spiritual baptism. It was very powerful. And at the same time, I started to see over the days of what spiritual materialism was. There was one loudspeaker over the other. There was one ashram over the other. This one joined this society or listened to this guru or so forth. And I became very disenchanted. As a matter of fact, I felt disheartened because I wasn't meeting such great beings that I heard only came out of caves every 12 years to come to this event. Until one day I met a man who was said to be over 90, and I started hanging out with him, and all he did all day was go to temples and bless people and bring people food. And to me, he was the most revered and saintly person there, so I spent most of my time with him. So instead of traveling with Pierre Vilayat afterwards to go to all these temples, to see all these, lamas and rishis and so forth, something told me inside to go to Kashmir. I don't know why. I heard it was the most beautiful place on earth. And I went to, I left the Ganges River, and it was a ceremonial sort of release at the time that I wasn't even aware of. I had taken on the orange garbs of the swamis, and I'd been studying the Bhagavad Gita on the Ganges River. But when I left the Ganges, when I left that world, when I left Kumbh Mela, I took off my orange robes, and I didn't mean it to be sacrilegious, but I hung them on a tree at the train station as my way to release that world. I think Baba wanted me to re-experience what it was like to be a devout Hindu and the power of the Bhagavad Gita, and I studied about Krishna and Rama. And then I left there and went to Kashmir. Wouldn't you know, the mantra that Pierre Vilayat gave me to study, Ya Kadir, turned out to be the name of the kitchen boy on the boat where I was staying. So instead of meditating and going more inward, I went to a place in the world that was very robust, full of the very high energy and very active Mohammedans that lived there in the village where I stayed. And instead of chanting Qadir, I'd call his name when I wanted something. My host said, if you want something, just call the kitchen boy. He'll get it for you. I said, what's his name? He says, Qadir. I said, okay, this must be Baba working somehow. So this experience, I mentioned it, helped me to come out from what was unlikely to be a long term of deep introversion and going deep into meditation. I realized the Baba didn't want that for me. He wanted me to learn how to live in the world and not be of it. It was a wonderful experience in Kashmir, culminating in about 2.5 months. The last week I was there, I went exploring, and I wanted to see some sights. And I went to a place that the Mughal emperors said it was the most beautiful place on earth, Shalimar Gardens. And I was meditating in a cave there near the gardens, and I actually had a vision of the Christ when I was coming out of this meditation, and the Christ morphed into Baba, and it was the most profound inner experience come out. I realized several years later when I came back to the States and I was in Myrtle Beach, I was telling this story to Hermes, and he said, where were you? And I told him. He says, well, you were in the next village over from Harvan village where Maya Baba did seclusion and said was the death place of Christ. I thought, that's very interesting. Baba brought me to India to show me my Hindu sanskaras and my Sufi and Christian sanskaras. And when it was time to go to Baba's tomb as part of this journey, which was the plan all along, I got a letter from the Mandali saying that the heat was unbearable and they were shutting down for the season. So I flew home in total despair. I felt like I had missed this golden opportunity in life, which came back 9 years later. And this is the journey that I went with my good friend, and we got to spend some time with the Mandali there. But my whole life has been a journey of not so much seeking Baba, but looking to find ways to make him my constant companion. And I spent a lot of time in Myrtle Beach because I find that the charge of the center, the vibration there is so filled with his presence. And yet, Baba has given us so many gifts, and the gifts particularly that he's given me is to strive to remember him, whatever is arising in life. And I've been very blessed to have learned about him in this life at an early age. I've reflected on my life very deeply in the last couple of years. I've had some serious health issues, and almost in a sense, close to death experiences. And I've come through strong and vital and very grateful. And throughout this process, it was Baba and the feeling that Baba was always there that guided me through to realize that he's always here and he's always present. And I particularly have liked the quotes of Baba that give me something to do instead of just a teaching or a cute little saying, you know. But one that has always stood by me is to live more and more in the present, which is ever beautiful and stretches away beyond the limits of the past and the future. And I feel like my journey with Baba has just begun. 50 years later. Jai Baba. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to add a little part that I left out. That's a very, just pretty amazing part of this whole story. Is Dr. Harry, my cousin, who I mentioned, and I have stayed very close over the years. And the person who he met at Albany Med that introduced him to Baba was a friend who recently passed, who is near and dear to many of us, Dr. Ken Lux. And wouldn't you know that within a short period of time, Dr. Harry put me on the phone with Ken so we could get to know each other. And Ken and I corresponded for a couple of years before we met at the Mela in Maine in 1975. And the reason why this story is very significant, what drew my cousin Harry to talk to Ken that day at the campus was seeing a Maya Baba button on his jacket. And he immediately recognized Baba. And, you know, God works in very mysterious ways. I think it was around 1967 or 68. Harry was a student at Suffolk University, and he was looking to buy a car, and he saw an ad in the paper. Long story short, him and his friend went. His friend was a car expert. And they went to an old rundown neighborhood in Dorchester, Roxbury, I think, in the Dorchester-Roxbury area of Boston. Very tough neighborhoods. It was a Sunday afternoon, and there was a very old couple in the living room that brought him in. They had tea and cookies, and they checked out the car, liked the car, didn't end up buying the car. But what they did notice is these people had pictures of this unusual looking person in their house and had a button on of Maya Baba. And they never asked the couple who it was. And they left and didn't buy the car. But when they were driving back to the house, my cousin said to his friend, "Who were those people? And who was that funny looking guy?" And they were so moved by the warmth, and he even said the love that he felt from these people, that it was very memorable. So when he saw that button on Ken that day, it sparked a memory. Who knows? Maybe that little button is the reason I even found out about Baba. Certainly when I was in high school. And that story was always, had a lot of meaning to me. And Harry said over the years, He said, I feel like I found out about Baba from Ken so that you could become a Baba lover. I said, well, Harry, you could become a Baba lover too. He said, well, I read that book about what Baba means by real work, and I realized that I'm here to do the work. He's been a doctor and really helped a tremendous amount of people in his life. I reminded him of this recently, and he says, well, something to the effect, well, I could be a Baba lover too. I said, yeah, it's not too late for that. So it was that little button, and somehow, you know, just that memory was sparked there, and I got the good results from that. Thank you, Baba.